They were only 4 hours into their voyage, and Rachel was ready to pistol whip her boss. One good smack in the face. It had barely hurt him. It would actually hurt quite a lot, and Rachel had a feeling that Theodore would take it personally. She contented herself with screwing in a loose bolt more vigorously than was necessary, wiping beads of sweat from her forehead as she did so. Theodore might not have been her boss in the traditional sense, more like the guy who owned the ship and made sure the occupants didn't kill each other. But he was still a typical corporation lackey, obsessed with hierarchy, efficiency, money, and a host of other corporate concerns that Rachel didn't care for. Swag, status report. Rachel glanced over her shoulder and saw the hazy blue hologrammatic head and shoulder of Theodore himself. Of course, he couldn't possibly make the trip all the way down to the engine room. Too many flashy displays needed his attention. Repairs 92% complete, she replied in an exaggerated monotone. Hull stability achieved. Archon drive almost at full capacity. Gore's batteries loaded. Ley line system. Report to the bridge. The hologram flickered and vanished, and she grinned. Technically, information overload was an insubordination, so it was Rachel's favorite method of irritation. It would sate her urge for a good pistol whipping for the moment at least. With a sigh, the young Kaltoran tucked the spanner into her tool belt and began the journey through the bows of the ship to the bridge. She definitely wasn't in a hurry. The Galantia wasn't a large ship, designed as it was to be operated by a skeleton crew, but it still took Rachel a fair effort to extricate herself from the tangle of wires and machinery that formed the engine room. It was a cut and shut vessel, formed from at least two different Kaltoran hulls and a Legion gunship, and stuffed full of the best spare parts the crew could acquire. Still, the Galantia's unique nature made her repairs and various patch jobs all the more interesting. It was the one part of the job that Rachel truly loved. With practiced precision, she swung herself onto the main catwalk that led to the exit. Heights and darkness never bothered her, or any Kaltoran after all. She'd grown up in the gigantic pit city with where dwellings honeycombed the deep crust of her home world. A childhood of badly lit walkways and cramped metal spaces made the engine room of the Galantia practically roomy. She emerged into the hallway, unbinding her long blue dreadlocks, and almost ran headlong into Maximus. The Legionnaire grabbed her by the shoulders with strong, gentle hands, thus avoiding the collision. Not that it would have hurt him, given that he was 8 feet of pure simian muscle wrapped in red tactical armor. Watch out for ears, Maximus grunted, letting her go and stepping to the side. Sorry, Max, Rachel said, smirking as she walked around and punched him on the arm. I'll try not to hurt you. Captain Colt? Yeah, probably another scolding. She arranged her face to what she thought was an approximation of Theodore's and put on her best high class corporate accent. Swagger, I think you might have set the self destruct. If we're not dead in 2 minutes, I'm taking this out of your commission. Bax stared at her, expressionless. Oh, that was good, Rachel said, pointing at the Legionnaire as she turned towards the bridge. Your impersonations are almost as good as mine. In reality, Rachel knew Maximus was a firm believer in Legion tradition, never disrespect a commander. Just then, as Rachel was about to round the corner, she heard Max's soft rumble. Captain would have sounded more growly. She whirled around to see Maximus disappearing into the armory and stood motionless for a moment before giving a short laugh. Maybe she could mold their ship's gunner into a rebel after all. Rachel had to pass the lab to get to the bridge, and she used the opportunity to check in on the group's resident Nephilim, a young woman in appearance with grey skin and tendril-like hair. Harak stood observing their prize, a mysterious piece of tech they'd swiped from under the noses of unscrupulous Draz raiders. No one was exactly sure what it was. It looked like a simple cube, a quarter meter wide, metallic silver with glowing purple veins in a fractal pattern and no visible controls, save for a large purple button in the center. Rachel had been all for pressing it, but Theodore had forbidden any action until they knew it wasn't something that would blow a hole in the ship. The artifact was suspended in an electrogravity field in the center of the lab, with Hrax intensely studying the data readouts on the surrounding displays. "How's it coming along?" Rachel said, leaning against the door frame. She immediately cursed herself. Too chirpy. Not good," Hrax replied, without shifting her eyes from the console. "The artifact does not respond to any testing or diagnosis method I currently have access to on this backward ships. Oh, be nice to Galatèa. She does her best." Rachel leant in to view the box, which saved her having to make awkward eye contact with Hrax. The two had a curious and volatile relationship. Rachel thrived on its curious nature, while Hrax thrived on its volatility. Rachel had little personal experience outside her homeworld's pit cities, but she had many memories genetically passed on from her parents and grandparents, dark memories of death and suffering brought on by Hrax's people, the Nephilim. Despite this, Rachel was keen to make new memories, better memories for the children she was yet to have. She wanted to build some kind of positive relationship with Hrax. The Nephilim had no room for such focused prejudice. Nephilim were equally prejudiced against everyone, even their own kind. Hrax was a Nephilim emissary, grown in a lab no more than 3 years ago, with a head full of false memories to give context to her implanted skills. A brilliant mind that jostled for space with an aggressive thirst for knowledge. Rachel couldn't imagine what it was like to be born full grown. Rachel turned from inspecting the mysterious box to see the Nephilim woman gazing at her with a curious expression. "What?" Rachel asked. "I was curious about your relationship with the ship," Hrax replied. "You spend such a great deal of time in the engine room, and you refer to it as if it were a person, as if it were alive, or one of us." "Some Nephilim ships are alive. The Galantia is obviously not alive." Rachel stepped back from the gravity field and folded her arms, pausing to think. "You can still form attachment to things that aren't alive. You make it alive with your imagination." "That is foolish," Hrax replied, turning back to her work. Rachel needed to word things in a way that Hrax could accept. "Think of it this way. By forming an attachment with something, it increases our investment in that thing, thus facilitating the lengths to which you will go to support said thing." Hrax was facing Rachel again. "That sounds like you are voluntarily choosing to believe a lie because you lack the faculty to. I know the ship is not alive, in the traditional sense of the word. People don't always mean exactly what they say." "That is also foolish." Hrax once again turned back to her work. "Did Captain not call for you?" "Right," the girl replied, backing out the door and nearly tripping over some loose coils. "Right, yeah, I'll get on that. Good luck with the thing." Hrax may have replied, but the lab door slid shut before she could hear it. The Kaltoran reached the door to the bridge and jogged on the spot for a few moments, just to make it seem like she'd been hurrying. Then she pressed her hand to the scanner and the door to the bridge slid open. By bridge standards, it wasn't all that impressive. A large transparent steel window loomed over 4 chairs arranged in a rough square, none of which were used regularly. Rachel was mostly in the engine room, Hrax in the lab, Maximus in the gun pod, and Theodore at the navigation console as he was now, cigarette in mouth, one hand in his pocket and the other tracing coordinates on the display. Texos, Theodore's personal drone, was engaged at the pilot station as always, its thin metal arms extending from a small circular hovering metal shell. Despite Theodore's constant control over the drone, knowing that the fate of the ship lay in the cold metallic stick fingers of a lifeless probe gave Rachel the shivers. "Reporting for duty," she barked, standing at the bridge's midsection and breathing heavily. I could hear you jogging outside the door. Rachel kept up her charade for a few more moments before rolling her eyes and leaning against the railing. "Fine. What do you need me for?" Theodore took a few moments to respond, engaged as he was in some kind of complex calculation. Rachel watched him for a moment, standing there in the impeccable dark suit and gold vest, cigarette hanging loosely from his mouth. His short hair was so controlled it was like he'd run over it with a toothbrush. The same could be said for his sparse stubble, spotless, clean cut, and utterly collected at all times. Theodore was practically the physical embodiment of the corporation. "I have new assignments for you," he said, removing the cigarette from his mouth and staring straight ahead into literal space. "It's going to last for the remainder of the voyage." "Just remember, I still have repairs from our escape," Rachel replied. "I'm not even sure if we'll get them done before we dock. This takes priority." "As in higher priority than life support?" "Ask Cracks to deal with that. I want you to work on optimizing our ley line drive. We need more speed." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were as simple as asking someone to pass the salt. Rachel bristled and folded her arms. "Harax is busy with the artifact, and I've told you, we—" The sensor console suddenly changed from green to red. Rachel wasn't well versed in sensor displays, but she made the assumption that this was a bad thing. Red generally meant trouble. The wailing siren was also a cue. "Unknown vessel approaching," chirped Texos in its usual high-pitched monotone that Theodore refused to change for some reason. "Signs of aggression. Unidentified beam technology. Locking on. Recommend." "Calm down, Texos," Theodore said, unruffled as his hands moved in a blur across the console. "Give me visual." Rachel stepped out of the way as a slight, fuzzy hologram sprang to life in the middle of the bridge, showing a large, well-armed battleship. The Kaltoran swallowed, instantly recognizing the ancient Archon design. Mechanid. "So, they found us," the captain mused. He reached to the far right of the holographic console and held down the intercom control. "Maximus, in the very unlikely event that you aren't already inside the gun pod, I need you in there. We have mechanids on our tail. Harax, if you're—" He and Rachel were thrown off balance by a sudden tremor that ran the full length of the ship, causing the lights to flicker. With her 4 keen ears, Rachel traced the echo to its source and felt her blood run cold. The engine room. She breathed, almost sprinting through the hologram and into the main corridor. Theodore called her back, but she couldn't stop. Somehow they'd found a way onto the ship. Those foul machines could be inside, ruining all of her precious work. If they did enough damage, it would cripple the Galatèa, leaving them all stranded. Or worse, she wouldn't allow that to happen. The trip from the engine room to the bridge had taken minutes. The return journey was over in seconds. Rachel charged through the door and heard the echoes from down below. It was cannon fire. Fueled by the unbridled rage of a girl who finds someone touching her stuff, Rachel vaulted over the catwalk and jumped from one pile of machinery to another. She descended into the bowels of the ship, wincing as the sound grew louder, until a brief somersault brought her to the walkway directly above the floor of the main engine room. Peering over the rail, it was exactly as she feared. A mechanid stood, flanked by machinery, firing its gun arm at everything in sight. While hot rage flooded through Rachel's veins, but she forced herself to think. That thing was a vaguely humanoid hunk of metal, and she was slightly more squishy. An array of purple orbs formed the mechanid sensor cluster, and she decided that these were her best target. Rachel silently drew a long dagger from her leg holster. Wished she had her gun. A flick of a switch bathed the blade's metal in a blue glow, all the better to slice rogue machines into bits. With a final glance, the young Kaltoran flung herself over the railing, dagger raised over her head, and her lips parted in a silent battle cry. This was when the plan went wrong. In the split second before the blade made contact, Rachel identified a faint aura similar to her daggers around the mechanid. It was an uncommon feature, but this machine was obviously meant to be an advanced guard and was therefore better protected. It had a burst shield, and it was too late to account for. Her strike was already descending. The dagger deflected off the shield and flew into the mass of machines, leaving Rachel to awkwardly land clinging to the mechanid's head. She wasn't there for long. leaping off and landing in a crouch, just in time for the Mechanid to wheel around and let loose with a barrage of cannon fire. She leapt forward, rolled, and came up in a sprint, ducking as the shells flew over her head. Scooping up her fallen dagger, Rachel dove behind the Galantea's large dorsal landing gear piston and pressed her back against the cold metal. The gunfire halted, replaced by the clanking of Mechanid footsteps. She didn't have a gun. Her dagger wouldn't work against the shield. She only had seconds before the Mechanid began tearing the place apart once more. This was definitely not what she'd signed up for. Rachel gritted her teeth and grasped the hilt of her weapon. The only weapon was to stall for time. She pulled herself onto the large piston and saw the Mechanid raise its purple sensor orbs towards her. The gun arm followed, and Rachel leapt to the next shot-blocking hunk of metal. She hopped from one piece of machinery to the next, ducking and weaving through pipes, coils, beams, and every other piece of haphazard equipment in the cluttered engine room. The Mechanid slowly turned on the spot, but she knew the room better than it did, and she gave it no chance for a clear shot. It was as she ducked behind a mass of thick coolant coils that the firing abruptly stopped. For a moment, Rachel thought that it had run out of ammunition, and she drew a dagger in preparation. Then there was a hiss of rapidly released gas. Oh, crap. She never expected to use a missile in such close quarters. The girl emerged from her hiding place in time to see a tiny torpedo arcing towards her position. She broke into a sprint, but the explosion blasted her off her feet. By explosion standards, it was small, but this didn't occur to Rachel as her slight frame catapulted through the air, landing almost directly in the middle of the engine room floor. The wind left her lungs and she came to a stop, the world spinning. Splayed on her back, Rachel raised her head just in time to see the barrel of a gun being pointed in her face. So this is it. Strangely, all she could think about was the fact that their water coils were now in flames and utterly ruined. The ship would now have cooling problems for the rest of the voyage. The barrel lit up with a purple glow and made a sound like rushing wind, signaling the end of her life. Then there was a loud clang, followed by an electrical discharge. The Mechanid's head snapped upwards and it began to tremble. Rachel was forced to roll backwards as the robot pitched on its face and lay in a heap, devoid of power. Theodore stood a little way off, smoke wafting from both the cigarette in his left hand and the pistol in his right. As per usual, he looked like he was posing for a photo shoot. If he hadn't just saved her life, Rachel would have rolled her eyes. He lowered the gun, and Rachel stood on shaky legs. She noticed that the back of the Mechanid's head was emitting an orange glow, and a slight fizzling sound, and realized that Theodore had switched his pistol from its usual energy rounds to swivel rounds, using a miniature nuclear reactor to fire an irradiated bullet at ridiculous speeds, spinning fast enough to cut through most known substances. The corporation considered these weapons illegal, given their penchant for uranium leaks. Theodore's gun was shielded, but many an intrepid adventurer had been swindled by shady dealers into carrying shoddy nuclear handhelds. "Where'd you get that?" Rachel panted, still catching her breath through the rippling pain down her side. "You're welcome," he replied. "Since when do you have a new gun? You can thank me any time. But your people consider those things illegal. Even having a gun equipped with, they're very efficient against distracted targets with burst shields." Rachel's calmer thoughts finally caught up with her adrenaline-laced ones. Thanks," she said, feeling sheepish. A curious expression flashed across Theodore's face. Was it concern? In a moment, though, he was back to his reserved self. "Don't mention it," he grunted, spinning his pistol in a full circle. It collapsed into a flat rectangle, which he clipped into his belt buckle. "Besides, there's a larger issue at hand." They took the elevator to the top of the engine room and made their way to the bridge, where Harax was already in the pilot's seat. Rachel limped straight for the diagnostic console, while Theodore moved to his own command station. Harax expertly avoided a hail of purple bolts as Galantea returned a well-aimed burst of gauze fire, striking the Mechanid ship's rear thruster and practically shearing it off. "Status report," the captain ordered. Rachel scanned the display and compressed the information in her head. Theodore wasn't a huge fan of frills. We're stable. They managed to land a hit on the hull, but the damage is minimal. Shields are at 90% efficiency. I suggest holding on, Harak said, vigorously jerking the controls to the left. Rachel caught a brief glimpse of a cluster of missiles careening towards them before her view screen tipped on its side and they went into a spiral. The homing missiles collided with each other and exploded, leaving only a few on their tail. Seconds later, a storm of shells from the Galatèa's gun pod cut down the stragglers. Theodore, who hadn't even stumbled during the ordeal, waved his hand across the holographic display, splaying it over the front viewport. Harak's offensive pattern, he said. Give Maximus the best shot possible. Harax nodded and brought them around to face the Mechanid ship, which had sustained even more damage in the interim. For a moment they were stationary, then the engines roared to life, propelling them straight for the enemy vessel. Engines at max output, Rachel reported. Acceleration is stable. The ships traded fire, and Rachel winced as the occasional shot pierced their shields. Maximus, aim for the fuel cells on my mark, the captain ordered. A grunt from the intercom was the only response. They were getting closer. They could now physically see the Mechanid ship, a large, cruel vessel shaped like a claw. It dwarfed the Galatèa, but this would work to their advantage, making it an easier target. They were almost at the collision point where the ship would be smashed like a bug on the windshield. Bank down, Theodore barked, and Harak sent the ship into a half spiral and had them sailing underneath the Mechanid ship. Fire! The Maximus let loose with their most powerful weapon, a Legion railgun, modified for close range and maximum damage. The Mechanid fuel cells ripped open. The single shell carved a deep scar on the ship's underside. Rachel transferred power to the engines as Harax punched the throttle. They blasted out from the shadow of the great ship in time to see the fuel cells go up in flames, quickly consumed by the lack of atmosphere. The Mechanid ship was dead in the void. There was a silence for a moment before Rachel realized that it was her job to speak next. Mechanid ship is crippled. Auto repairs seem to be underway, but they don't have movement. The Galatèa is stable, minor damage to the landing gear, and 2 shield nodes are burnt out. That'll give them something to worry about, Theodore replied. Maximus, report to the bridge. The entire ship shook, and Rachel was thrown out of her seat. The metal floor didn't make for a particularly soft landing. What was... The sentence remained unfinished as a purple crack ripped open in the center of the bridge, flooding the room with light. A Mechanid tumbled out of the breach, landing on its feet, and immediately aimed its gun at the main console. Harax was faster. The Nephilim whipped out her spine rifle and blasted the Mechanid's head off with a well-placed burst of bone needles. It trembled and collapsed, a crack in the air already sealing. There was another moment of shocked silence. Harax, get us out of here, Theodore ordered, turning back to the navigation console and punching in the destination. Full speed. I don't know how they're getting onto the ship, but I want them gone. Harax dropped her rifle and gunned the engines. In seconds, the Mechanid ship was a speck in the distance and rapidly vanishing. Rachel with me, the captain continued. Rachel nodded and drew her gun as Theodore unfolded his own. You think there are more? Almost certainly. We'll meet up with Maximus then. They both halted as the corridor outside echoed with gunfire. There was the sound of grinding metal, clanking footsteps, and a lot of roaring, followed by an ominous wrenching. Theodore crossed to the door, pistol aimed forward, and reached for the button. Before he could press it, the door slid open, revealing the hulking frame of Maximus. Rachel exhaled with relief as she saw he was unharmed. Then she noticed the 2 Mechanid heads dangling by wires from the Legionnaire's hands, with their bodies lying in the corridor beyond. They might have been robots, but it was somehow still a gruesome sight. I checked, Maximus grunted, still framed in the doorway. They're all dead. Theodore nodded and holstered his pistol. When Maximus said there was no more fighting to be done, there usually wasn't. So it's over, Rachel breathed, sinking back into her chair. They were away, and everyone was safe. Her stupid, argumentative, dysfunctional family was safe. Her relief was palpable. Theodore kicked the headless mechanid body that lay in the center of the bridge with an expression of disdain. It's not over until I find out how they got on my ship, and that damn artifact is sold. Rax, take them apart. Without a backwards glance, Theodore turned and left the bridge. Maximus still holding the mechanid heads, watching him go. Let's just be glad there were only 4 of them, Rachel said, to break the silence. I wouldn't want to go up against an entire ship's worth. Maximus grunted and stalked out, but not before mumbling something that sounded very much like, speak for yourself. Rachel glared at the back of his head, but the Legionnaire didn't notice. The mechanid husks lay piled in the lab, where Maximus had dumped them hours before. 3 were missing their heads, while 1 had a single bullet hole in its central processor. The lab was dark, lit only by the soft purple glow of the box suspended in the electrogravity field. There was a soft hum. The sound wasn't loud enough to penetrate the walls, but it echoed around the room and seemed to multiply until it created a mechanical harmony. The purple veins on the box began to pulse erratically, as if transmitting some kind of code. The mechanid that still retained its head stirred. Then its purple sensor orbs flickered and slowly lit up one by one. Cool. I hope you enjoyed that reading. That was the introductory first short story from Fragged Empire, first edition. That first time meeting Rachel, Rax, Theodore, and Max. And so, yeah, thought that'd just be a fun read. Hope you enjoyed.